the thing nobody tells you about a desert at night is how it gives you back your own breathing. There's no traffic to swallow it, no neighbor's television, no leaf in the wind. Just you and your lungs and a sky that goes on without you. When I first came out to the facility, I thought the silence would be the hardest part. It turned out the silence was the only part of the job I ever really loved. I'd been there about 8 months when I found the door. I was 28 at the time, a junior research assistant in what they called the Environmental Survey Group, which was a very official way of saying that I cataloged soil samples in plastic sleeves and wrote down what the weather had done. We were a small team, and most of us were nobody. That was the point. There are people at that facility whose names will never be in print, and there are people like me whose names are simply not interesting enough to be classified. I had clearance. I just didn't have the clearance. I'm going to tell you about it slowly, because that's the only way I know how to tell it now. I've had a long time to think about what happened to me out there, and I've stopped trying to make it sound coherent in the way that stories are supposed to sound coherent. The truth is I went down a hallway I shouldn't have been able to open. Then I went down it again. Then again. And by the time I understood what I was walking through, the walking had already happened, and I had already become someone who could not unwalk it. I should tell you why I was out there in the first place. My brother had died the spring before. His name was Daniel, and he was 4 years older than me, and there's no need to say much more about it than that. He was sick, and then he was sicker, and then he was a phone call my mother made from a parking lot. The grief was not dramatic. That's what surprised me. I had expected something operatic, something cinematic, and instead what I got was a long, low pressure in my chest, like the way your ears feel before a storm. I went to work. I made coffee. I forgot to buy groceries and then bought too many. The pressure didn't lift, it just got familiar. I was a geology master's, decent grades, no particular ambition. I'd been working at an environmental consulting firm in a strip mall that smelled like printer toner and microwaved soup. The job out at the facility came to me through a professor I barely remembered. He sent me an email with a paragraph in it and a phone number, and the paragraph said almost nothing. Government contract, remote location, 18-month posting, room and board provided, salary attached. I called the number. A woman with a flat voice asked me 3 questions about my education and 1 question about whether I currently had pets. I said no. She said someone would be in touch. 2 weeks later, I was on a small plane out of a small airport with a duffel bag on my lap and the smell of jet fuel in my hair. The facility is in the desert. I won't tell you which desert. People who have worked there talk around it in a particular way, and the way of talking around it becomes a kind of fingerprint, and I am trying not to leave one. I will tell you that the road in is unmarked, and that you drive for a long time past nothing, and that the last 40 minutes of the drive is on a surface that pretends to be a road, but is really only the agreement of vehicles that have come before. The sky out there is the color of an old photograph at noon, and the color of a bruise at dusk. There are mountains in the middle distance that never seem to get any closer no matter which direction you're driving. They were on a different schedule than the rest of the geography. The facility itself is low and beige and tries hard to look unimportant. From the outside, it could be a regional water authority or an unloved community college. There's a chain-link fence and a guardhouse and a parking lot full of trucks that all look like they belong to the same uncle. Inside, the building is a labyrinth in the way that government buildings always are. long corridors with seams in the linoleum, ceiling tiles that are almost the right color, a smell that is somehow both clean and old. The fluorescent lights hum at a frequency you stop noticing on the second day, and then notice again, very suddenly, around 3 in the morning, the way you notice your own pulse when you try to fall asleep. I had a room in the staff housing block. A single bed, a wooden dresser, a window that looked at another window across a courtyard, with a single ornamental tree in it that no one had thought to water. I had a small kettle and a tin of tea bags and a paperback novel I was perpetually halfway through. There was a cafeteria and a recreation room with a pool table whose felt had been worn shiny in a single oval where everyone's elbows rested. There was a library of about 300 books, donated, decades old, with names written inside the front covers in handwriting that no longer belonged to anyone. I read a lot of them. The reading helped. The reading and the silence and the desert and the work. The work was what I want to tell you about. My days were small. I would wake at 6, walk to the cafeteria for coffee and an egg, walk to the lab, badge in, sit at a long metal table under a lamp, and open the day's intake. The intake was soil cores collected the previous day by other people whose names I knew, but whose faces I rarely saw. They went out into the desert in small trucks and came back with tubes of dirt, and they brought the tubes to us, and we logged them, photographed them, weighed them, ran them through small machines that made small noises. I wrote numbers in a database that I assumed someone, somewhere, eventually read. Sometimes I would also be assigned atmospheric readings, temperature, humidity, particulate counts, a column of figures that I would carry on a clipboard from one office to another, hand to a senior researcher, and be thanked for. The work was so mundane that I sometimes laughed at myself for the dramatic version of the job I had imagined the night I first signed the paperwork. I had thought maybe I would see something. Maybe I would touch something interesting. Mostly, I touched dirt. There were rumors, of course. There are always rumors at a place like that. They lived in the corners of conversations like dust in a baseboard. People joked about black helicopters and called it humor. Senior researchers would walk through our lab to go into wings we didn't have access to, and we would not ask them where they were going. There was a kind of professional politeness about not asking, the way there is a kind of professional politeness about not asking your dentist about her divorce. We knew, in the abstract way that nobody admitted to knowing, that the facility was on a list that did not exist. Online, people would have called us by a name with a number in it. We never said the name. The not saying of it was part of being there. My supervisor was a woman named Dr. Marisol Vance. She was in her late 50s, tall, white-haired, with the careful diction of someone who had once been very bad at a foreign language and had since gotten very good. She wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and a wool cardigan even in summer, because the air conditioning in our wing was set to a temperature that would have frozen a butcher's locker. She was kind to me in the slightly distant way that academic women of her generation were sometimes kind, as if she was being kind to a younger version of herself she did not entirely respect. I liked her. I still like her, even now. She was the first person to use my full name without smiling, which is a thing I've grown to appreciate. There was a man named Henry who worked across the hall and made his own bread on weekends, and a man named Bridges who worked security and who had taught me, in the first month, the way the badge readers worked. The small chime when your card was accepted, the lower tone when it was rejected, the little red light that meant try again, the little green light that meant the lock was thinking. I always think of it that way. The lock was thinking. That's how Bridges had said it. There's a quarter second between the swipe and the click, and in that quarter second, the lock is thinking, deciding whether to let you in. Most people don't notice the pause. Once you've noticed it, you can't stop. The corridors of the facility were arranged by letter. My wing was D, which I gathered was junior staff country, cataloging, intake, low-level analytics. A wing, B wing, and C wing I went to occasionally with paperwork. There were wings whose letters I never said out loud, because I never had a reason to be in them, and saying their letters out loud felt presumptuous. I would walk to the end of D wing in the evening sometimes, just to stretch my legs after a day at the table, and I would stand at the junction where D met the long, unnamed corridor that ran the spine of the building, and I would look down that corridor at the doors I didn't have access to. The doors were unremarkable. Metal, beige, with a number stenciled at chest height and a card reader to the right. It was the unremarkability that I think made them interesting to me. The most secret doors I have ever seen looked exactly like every other door. The night I found the one that opened was a Tuesday. I remember because Henry had brought a sourdough loaf into the cafeteria at lunch, and Tuesdays were his bread day. I'd worked late, finishing a batch of intake that had come in dirty, by which I mean literally dirty, the cores cracked in transit, the sleeves leaking. I was tired in the way you only get tired in a windowless room. It was about 10 at night. The day staff had gone, and the corridors had that particular emptiness that buildings get when most of their people have left them. I needed to take a walk before I went back to my room, because I knew if I went back too tense, I wouldn't sleep. I walked the long way. I went down D wing, took the spine corridor, and turned at a junction I didn't usually take, which led toward a part of the building I'd been through maybe twice. There was a stairwell at the end of that corridor, and I had a vague idea I might climb it just to climb it, to give my legs something to do. I didn't make it to the stairwell. About halfway down, I noticed a door that was very slightly ajar. Not open, just not quite latched. The way a door is when it has been closed in a hurry by someone whose mind was already somewhere else. I stood in front of it for a minute. I don't know how to explain why. I have replayed that minute many times, and I cannot tell you what I was thinking. The hallway was empty. The lights were doing their fluorescent thing. The door was a door. The number above the reader was 217. The reader had a small black face with a slot in it and a single LED that was currently dark. I lifted my badge to it, not even meaning to use it, just lifting it the way you lift a hand to a banister you're about to grab. The reader chimed. The lock thought for a quarter of a second. The light went green. I want to tell you that I closed the door and walked away. I did, eventually, but not before I opened it the rest of the way. The corridor beyond was unlit. That was the first thing. Not dim, unlit, the kind of unlit that suggests no one had asked for the lights to come on in a long time. The fluorescent of the hallway behind me cast a yellow rectangle into the dark for about 4 feet and then gave up. The air that came out smelled different from the rest of the facility. Not bad, not chemical. Just older, the way a closet in a house your grandparents owned smells older than the rest of the house. There was a coolness to it, a faint draft, which meant the corridor went somewhere. Buildings without drafts are buildings that end in walls. I stood in the threshold for what felt like a long time. I did not step in. I think now that not stepping in that first night was the only sensible thing I did. I looked, and I listened, and I heard nothing, and I closed the door. The lock clicked. The reader's LED went dark. I walked back to my room. I made tea. I did not drink it. I sat on my bed with my back against the wall and watched the steam come up out of the cup in a thin, twisting line until it stopped, and the tea cooled, and I still had not slept. Around 4 in the morning, I gave up and watched the courtyard get gray. The ornamental tree did not move. There was no wind. I went to work the next day and did my job and did not tell anyone. That was a small decision and a large one. I think if I had told Dr. Vance, the entire next year of my life would have been different. I am not sure if it would have been better. The next night, I went back. It was 11 this time. I waited longer on purpose. I wanted the wing to be empty. The hallway was the same hallway it had been the night before, which surprised me a little. The way a place you have done something private in is always faintly surprising the second time you see it being ordinary. I lifted the badge. The reader chimed. The lock thought. The light went green. I took 2 steps in, and the lights came on. That was the part I had not prepared for. I had assumed the night before that the corridor was permanently dark, that it was forgotten, abandoned, a wing that had been closed at some point and never reopened. But somewhere along the wall, a motion sensor had been waiting, and now a long row of fluorescents flickered up in sequence, the way they do, the first one humming on, then the next, all the way down to a vanishing point about 60 feet ahead, where the corridor turned. I stood very still. I waited for an alarm. I waited for footsteps. None came. The hum of the lights was indistinguishable from the hum of the lights in my own wing, which made me feel for a moment that I had not crossed any threshold at all, that this corridor was simply another corridor in a building made of corridors. I let the door close behind me. I heard the lock think the other way around, deciding to be locked again. And I felt, briefly, a kind of nausea. The kind you feel when you realize you have just done something you cannot undo by simply turning around. I walked. The corridor was wider than the ones in D-Wing. The floor was the same gray composite tile, but unworn. There were no traffic patterns, no small scuffs near the doors, none of the wear of human feet. The doors I passed were closed and unlabeled. No numbers, no stencils, no nameplates. There was a long, quiet feeling of disuse, but not of decay. Nothing was dusty. The corridor was, somehow, both unused and maintained. I have no other way to describe it. I went to the bend and around it, and the corridor continued. About another 100 feet. Then it ended in a door that was different from the others. This one had a window in it, a small wired glass square at eye level. The room beyond was dark. I stood at the door for some minutes, working up to looking through the window, and when I finally did, the room was empty. Empty except for one thing. A chair in the middle of the floor, bolted down. The chair was metal, the kind of utilitarian thing you might see in a waiting room of a building that did not care if you wanted to stay. There were no restraints on it. It was simply a chair. But it had been bolted to the floor in the middle of an otherwise featureless room, and it had been bolted to face a particular direction, toward the wall opposite the door, which had nothing on it. No screen, no window, no diagram. The chair was angled with the precision of something that had been measured, and remeasured to face a specific point that was no longer there. I want to be careful about how I describe what I felt looking at that. It was not fear, exactly. It was a feeling I have come to associate with very specific kinds of architecture. Empty churches in the off-season, hospital chapels at night, the auditorium of an old school after the lights are turned off. There is a feeling that arises in rooms that have been designed for an event that is not currently happening. The room remembers what it was for. You can sometimes feel the shape of the remembering, even when the event is gone. I did not try the door. I told myself I did not want to be in a room with a chair like that. The truth is, I think I did not want to be observed sitting in it, even by myself. I left. I walked back. I badged out, and the corridor lights cut off behind me one by one as I rounded the bend, the sequence reversing. I did not sleep again. I made the tea again. I watched the steam stop. I told myself this could not become a habit. It became a habit. The next night I went farther. Past the chair room, the corridor branched. I took the left branch the first time, the right branch the second, mapping in my head, telling myself that I was being methodical and would stop at any sign of trouble. There was no trouble. There were only more doors, more empty rooms, more long stretches of corridor that descended very slightly, so that you would not have noticed unless you were watching your own footsteps. The grade was perhaps 1 degree, maybe 2. Enough that, an hour into the walk, you found yourself somewhat lower than where you had begun, and could not, in retrospect, point to the moment you had started going down. The rooms were all variations on a theme. I want to describe a few of them, because what I am trying to convey is that none of them, individually, contained anything you could pin to a horror. There was no blood. There was nothing twitching in a corner. The horror was in the cumulative effect, the way the rooms made you feel like you were walking through the residue of a long, careful, polite institution that had been doing something it could not put on a brochure. There was a chamber whose walls were covered, floor to ceiling, in handwritten equations. The handwriting was the same on every wall, a small, precise hand that pressed too hard, so that each character was slightly dug into the paint. The equations covered 4 walls and the ceiling. I recognized the notation of differential geometry. I recognized partial derivatives and tensors, and the slightly drunken-looking dots and dashes of indexed components. I am not a physicist. I had taken 2 semesters of physics for distribution and 1 statistics class because my advisor told me to. But the equations went on for so long and so densely that I could follow the early steps the way you can follow the first chords of a piece of music whose tune you don't quite know. They moved through what I am almost sure was a derivation involving closed time-like curves, paths that loop back on themselves, where a thing can be its own cause. And then they moved past that, into territory I could not follow at all. The conclusion was written on the far wall, in larger letters, double underlined, and I stood in front of it for a long time without reading it. I want to be honest with you about this. I could read it. I could see the letters. I could see the numbers, but I did not let my mind put them together. There is a particular muscle you can use to keep yourself from understanding something, a kind of held breath of the attention. I held mine. I looked at the conclusion for as long as it took me to be sure I had not understood it. And then I turned away and walked out of the room and into the corridor, and did not think about it for the rest of the night. That sounds melodramatic. I know it does. But I have spent the years since wondering whether the held breath was the only thing that saved me in the small way I was saved. I have a theory about that. I'll get to it. There was a chamber I came to think of as the viewing room. It had a long observation window built into one wall, the kind you see in neonatal wards or in psychiatric facilities, heavy glass, slightly green at the edges, set in a steel frame. On my side of the glass was a row of office chairs and a long counter with several recessed jacks for headphones and a single yellow notepad with no writing on it. On the other side of the glass was a chamber maybe 20 feet square. Pale walls, pale floor. No furniture, no equipment, lit from above by a soft, recessed glow that made the room feel like a photograph of a room rather than a room. There was no door on the other side of the glass. I looked and walked the length of the window and could not find one. The far chamber appeared to be sealed. I stood at that window for a long time. I could not tell you for how long. The chamber on the other side of the glass had the specific emptiness of a stage between acts, not vacant, just waiting. I had the very clear impression, standing there, that I was looking at a room that was used regularly, and that the things that happened in it were currently not happening, and that they would resume on a schedule I was not privy to. Nothing moved. Nothing made sound. I could see my own faint reflection in the glass, my hair pulled back, my badge clipped to the breast pocket of the cardigan I'd started wearing because Dr. Vance was right about the air conditioning. My reflection looked back at me. I have never had a clearer view of the small, frightened animal of my own face. The clock was in the next room. By this point, I'd been making these visits for about 3 weeks. I had a small routine. I would eat dinner in the cafeteria with Henry and listen to him talk about sourdough hydration ratios. And then I would go to my room and read for an hour. And then around 10:30, I would walk the long way, badge in, and go down. I did not go far each night. I had made a decision, somewhere along the line, that I would only go as far as a single new room each visit. The decision was a way of pretending I was still in control of how far I was going. It was also a way of stretching out the discovery. There was something, and I am uncomfortable saying this, but it is true. There was something pleasurable about the visits. The desert at night, the empty corridors, the small rituals of the lights coming on and the lights going off. The quiet act of pressing my badge to a reader and watching a lock think. It was the only time I was not, in any sense, being a junior researcher. I was being something else. I was being a person who knew a secret. The clock room had a desk and a chair and a wall clock. The clock was an ordinary institutional clock, the kind you see in classrooms, with a white face and black numerals and a thin red second hand. It was running. It was, in fact, the only thing in any of these rooms that was running. The second hand moved with that small, soft tick that the cheap ones make. I stood in front of it and watched, because in a series of rooms that had been mostly silent and still, movement was unusual. After about a minute, I noticed something. I have a wristwatch. It was my brother's. He'd left it to me in the way that brothers leave things, without leaving them, exactly, just by not picking them up before he died. It is a plain steel watch with a white face and a thin black second hand, and it is the most reliable mechanical object I have ever owned. It loses about 2 seconds a month. I lifted my wrist and held it up next to the clock on the wall. The second hands were not synchronized. That, by itself, was not strange. 2 different clocks rarely tick at the same instant. What was strange was that they did not stay in sync with each other. Over the course of perhaps 30 seconds, the second hand on the wall clock fell behind. The drift was small, maybe a tenth of a second per second, maybe less, but it was there. I watched my brother's watch make a clean trip around its dial, and the wall clock did not quite finish the same trip in the same time. It came up short. It was running slightly slow, and it was running slightly slow consistently, which is not how a broken clock runs. A broken clock runs erratically. This clock was running on a different rate. I did not stay in that room very long. I will tell you that I noticed, as I left, that the air in the room had a particular taste, like the inside of a metal cup. I think I made that up. I think I made the taste up in retrospect because I needed something physical to attach the experience to. Memory does that. Memory always does that. I should tell you about the binders. There was a small room. I came to it on a Thursday in my 5th week of visits. That was just a records room. Metal shelves, 3-ring binders. The binders had labels on the spines that were typed on a typewriter, the kind with a slightly uneven baseline that suggests the typist did not pause for the carriage return. The labels said things like Subject 17, Subject 19, Subject 23. The numbers were not consecutive. There were gaps. I do not know what to do with that, even now. I am trying not to make too much of it. I picked up Subject 19 because 19 had been my brother's age when he first got sick, and I had reached the point in my life where small numbers were starting to behave like superstitions. The binder was full of paper that had been printed on a dot matrix printer, the kind of paper with the perforated edges still attached. The printout described, in extraordinarily dry language, an experiment performed over 36 months on a single individual who was referred to only by their subject number. The experiment involved a chamber, a chair, a series of audio prompts, and what the document referred to as observational input. The methodology section talked about repeated exposures, controlled variables, baselines, and a category of measurement I had not seen before. It was called response integration. I read the page twice and could not produce a definition of what response integration was. I read it a third time and realized that the document was assuming I already knew. Toward the back of the binder was a section labeled, in the same typed from a typewriter style, status. I want to be careful here about what I say. The status section was a single page. The entry on it, in the same uneven typed font, said only that the subject had stopped reporting to work, and then a date, and then a line for follow-up that was blank. That was the phrase, stopped reporting to work. There were 3 more binders on that shelf and 2 more after them, and several of them had the same phrase at the back. Stopped reporting to work. Different dates. Different subject numbers. No follow-up. No theory, just the closing of the file. I did not take the binders. I want to be clear about that. I did not take anything. I left everything where I had found it. I had the strong feeling, by then, that I was already doing too much by reading. I went home that night, and I did not sleep at all. I sat on the bed with my legs pulled up and the blanket around my shoulders, and I watched the ornamental tree not move in the courtyard. And at some point around 5 in the morning, I realized I had stopped breathing through my mouth. I was breathing through my nose, slowly, the way you do when you are very alert. I had been alert for hours and had not noticed. It is a small thing to tell you. It is also the moment I think I understood that something was beginning to change about the way I was, and that the change had begun some weeks before I noticed it. The audio recording was on a different night. I was further in by then, perhaps a quarter mile, by my estimate, although the corridors had been turning gently enough that it was hard to be sure. There was a room with a metal cart in the middle of it, and on the cart was a reel-to-reel tape machine, very old, dust-free in the same maintained way that the rest of the wing was dust-free, plugged into a wall socket that had been spliced into the conduit with neat tape. There was a pair of headphones on a hook on the side of the cart. There was a single reel of tape mounted on the left spindle, with the leader threaded across the heads to an empty take-up reel on the right. I did not put the headphones on the first time. I came back the next night and put them on. The recording was 41 minutes long. I know because I listened to all of it. It was a recording of a session, conducted in what I now believe was the chamber on the other side of the viewing window, the empty one, the stage. There was a voice, male, middle-aged, calm, with a faint accent I could not place, narrating the start of the session. He said his own name, which I will not repeat, because the name is the only thing in this entire account that I have ever been able to confirm. He said a date. The date was 1979. He gave instructions. He said, "Please remain still, and please do not speak." He said, "We are going to begin in a moment." He said, "You may experience a sensation of being observed. You may experience a sensation of being recognized. You are not required to respond to these sensations. If you experience them, please continue to refrain from speaking." Then there was a long silence. I do not know how long. There was hiss, the kind of hiss old tape gives you. There were small ambient sounds, the soft creak of a chair, a faint movement of fabric, a single throat clear about 12 minutes in. There were no voices. There was no music. There was no event in the way that we usually mean event. And then, around minute 28, there was something I am not going to be able to describe to you in a way that will satisfy either of us. The hiss did not stop, but something within the hiss shifted, the way the timbre of a room shifts when someone has entered it behind you. There was no sound of footsteps. There was no audible voice, but the room on the tape was no longer empty. It was the same way you can tell, on a phone call, when the person on the other end is no longer alone. I do not know how to defend that statement. I am telling you what I heard. After perhaps 3 minutes of that, the male voice on the tape, the narrator's, the one I had heard at the start, said very quietly, "Thank you." He said, "We are concluding the session." He said the date again. The session ended. The tape ran out into clean hiss for another 4 minutes before someone, presumably the narrator, switched the machine off. The recording cut. I took the headphones off. I felt the way you feel after a long conversation with someone whose face you cannot remember afterward. I rewound the tape and put the headphones back on the hook. I did not stay in the room. I went home, and this time I slept. I slept for 14 hours. I missed my shift the next day. Dr. Vance asked me, the morning after, whether I was feeling all right. I said I was coming down with something. She gave me one of her careful looks, the kind that did not require me to answer, and said, "Take the weekend." I took the weekend. I did not go back down. I read paperbacks on my bed and watched the desert turn from beige to gold to red and back, and I made a great deal of tea, and I thought about what I had heard. I thought about it the way you think about a piece of music that has gotten stuck in you, where the thinking is also a form of listening. I started, around Sunday afternoon, to put a shape on what I had been seeing. What the program was doing, or had been doing, I was not sure if any of it was still active, was not what people from the outside imagined when they imagined a place like this. There were no creatures. There were no spacecraft. There was, as far as I could tell from what I had seen, no biological subject of any kind. What there was a long, patient, very careful series of experiments aimed at a boundary. The boundary was not in space. It was in something else. The chair bolted to face nothing. The chamber whose walls were the workings out of a theory of time-like loops. The viewing window into a chamber waiting between acts. The clock that ran slow. The session with the long silence and the change of timbre at minute 28. The binders of subjects whose files closed with the phrase, "Stopped reporting to work." I do not want to pretend that I solved this in a weekend, alone in my room. I want to be honest about what I came to. a working hypothesis, more like the shape of an idea than the idea itself. The work, I thought, had to do with time, specifically with whether something, and I had no word for what something, could be approached or addressed across what we ordinarily take to be the direction of time. The hypothesis underneath the work, I thought, was that what we experience as the forward arrow of time is not as fundamental as we think. That at some level, and I was reaching here, into things I had read in college and forgotten, and was reassembling badly, the universe might be more like a block than a stream. Everything that has ever happened and ever will happen, all of it laid out, all of it present, and our consciousness moving through it like a needle through grooves. If that were so, the question the work was asking was whether you could turn that needle. Whether you could send a signal not through space, but through the block itself, to some moment that had already happened, or some moment that would. Whether you could communicate with something that lived in the dimension we cannot perceive, which is to say, all of when. I am putting it that way because that is how it eventually sat in my head. The work at the time was not laid out so neatly. The work was binders and recordings and equations and chairs facing nothing. But that was the shape of it. That was what they had been doing. And the other thing, the thing that sat next to the first thing and would not let it rest. The other thing was that the people who had done this work had stopped reporting to work. Not all of them. Some of them, the most senior, the ones whose names presumably appeared on the binder's covers, had presumably gone on to fine and well-pensionied retirements somewhere. But the subjects, the ones with the numbers, the people who had sat in chairs and faced things that were not there, had, in number after number, simply stopped. The follow-up lines blank. No accounts, no explanations, no theory. I came back to work on Monday. I did my job. I walked back down on Monday night. I did not stop going. That is the part I am not sure I can explain to you, even now. I knew, by Monday, what I had likely walked into. I went back. I told myself I needed to understand it. I told myself that having seen what I had seen, the responsible thing to do was to see the rest of it, so that I could carry it out. I think now that those reasons were not the real reasons. The real reason was simpler and less flattering. I had begun to feel like a person again, down there. The pressure in my chest, the one that had been there since the parking lot phone call, was different in the corridors. Not gone. Different. The corridors gave me something to walk through. They were the first thing in months that had been larger than my grief. There was a binder I had not opened on my first visit to the records room. I came back to it on a Wednesday, the week after my weekend off, because I had remembered it without meaning to. It was on a shelf by itself, slightly apart from the numbered binders, with no number on the spine. The label read only theoretical reference. It was thinner than the others. The paper inside was higher quality, the printing crisp, the typeface more recent. There was a table of contents in the front, half a page, with section headings I will not pretend I understood at a glance. The measurement problem, observer-dependent collapse, the Wigner formulation, decoherence as the residue of recognition, subjectivity as a coordinate, block time models and the appearance of flow, the implications for memory. I read for perhaps an hour. I read more carefully than I had ever read anything in my life. I will not pretend I understood it. I will say only that the document was the closest thing I found, in all of those months, to an apology. It made the case, politely, and with a great deal of math I could not follow, that the kind of work being done in those chambers had unavoidable effects on the observer, that you could not engage with the boundary they were studying without being changed by the engagement. That consciousness, in their framework, was not a separable instrument but a coordinate, and shifting it had consequences. That, as a matter of administrative policy, junior staff had been kept at a sufficient distance from the work, physically, conceptually, contractually, because conscious engagement with the work was the thing that changed people, and the change was not, in their experience, reversible. That was where I stopped reading. There was a paragraph I had glanced at, 2 pages back, about an additional consideration. I went back to it. The paragraph was short. It said that in a small number of cases, they would not say how small subjects had reported experiencing the work as a form of consolation. The paragraph noted that this was particularly common in subjects who had recently experienced grief. The paragraph noted that the consolation, in the subject's own words, took the form of an intuition that loss did not function in the way they had thought it did. The paragraph noted that this intuition appeared to correlate, statistically, with the probability that the subject would later stop reporting to work. Someone had underlined a phrase on that page. I had not noticed it the first time because the underline was very faint. It was done in pencil by a hand that was not the same hand as the one that had typed the document. The phrase was 3 words: loss is temporary. I closed the binder. I put it back on its shelf. I walked out of the records room and down the corridor and back up the slight grade and out the door and badged out and went back to my room. I did not make tea. I sat on the bed with my hands in my lap and looked at the dark window and tried to think about my brother for the first time in some weeks. I could think about him. I could see his face and remember his laugh. He had a laugh that started in his chest and worked outward, the way some buildings light up floor by floor in the evening. I could remember the last conversation we'd had, which had been about a movie. I could remember with some surprise that the pressure in my chest, while still there, was no longer the same shape. It had been a stone. It was now more like a held breath. Held breaths can be released. Stones cannot. I sat there for a long time. I thought about what the document had said. I thought about the underlined phrase. I tried to remember whether I had ever underlined anything in pencil in my life, and was almost sure I had not. I thought about the woman whose hand had pressed too hard into the equations on the wall, and I thought about the man whose voice had said thank you at minute 28, and I thought about the subjects whose files closed with the phrase that no one had bothered to revise. I thought about my own clearance and how it was perhaps not as accidental as I had let myself believe, that the door had opened for me on a Tuesday in October because somebody, somewhere in a permission tree, had wanted it to open for somebody. Maybe for me, maybe for whoever found it. The work, after all, was a long study of the boundary between what we are and what time is. And one of the things you would want in a study like that would be someone capable of going down a hallway alone in the middle of the night because they were looking for a place to put their grief. I want to tell you that I quit the next day. I did not quit the next day. I worked out my contract. I went back to D Wing and to the soil cores and to Henry's bread and to Dr. Vance's careful kindness, and I did my work, and I did not go back through the door. I did not go back through the door once after that night. I want to be clear that I am almost sure I did not go back. I have a small recurring doubt about a few specific nights in the spring that followed, and I think that the doubt is just the kind of doubt anyone gets about a stretch of their own life that was particularly strange. But I will not pretend the doubt is not there. It is there. It will probably always be there. That is part of what the work does to you, I think. Once you have stood in front of the conclusion you would not let yourself read, you can never entirely close the door on the possibility that you read it anyway. That is the kind of damage the binder was warning about. It is not loud damage. It is the quiet kind. I finished out the 18 months. I left the facility on a small plane out of the same small airport, with the same duffel bag on my lap. The pressure in my chest by then was different again. I will not say better. I will say the shape of it had changed enough that I could carry it without thinking about it constantly, which is, I suppose, what most people mean when they say they're doing better. I moved back east. I took a job at a state environmental agency that pays badly and lets me work outside in the spring. I am, by every external measure, fine. I do think about the phrase, though. I think about it more than I probably should. Loss is temporary. I do not believe it the way the underliner appears to have believed it. I do not have a theory of the block time universe that would let me say with a straight face that my brother is still occurring somewhere on a coordinate I cannot reach. But I will tell you that I no longer believe it the other way, either. I no longer believe the version of loss I believed in the parking lot. I believe something in between, and I do not have a name for it, and I am not entirely sure I came up with it on my own. That is the thing about that kind of work. That is the thing the document was telling me in the paragraph I should not have read. You do not come back from engaging with it. You come back from somewhere adjacent to it, and you carry whatever has stayed with you. Some people carried more than I did. Some people stopped reporting to work. I came home. I will tell you one more thing, and then I will let you sleep. I still have my brother's watch. I wear it every day. It still loses about 2 seconds a month, the way it always has, the way it did before any of this. But every once in a while, when I am sitting in a quiet room, a doctor's waiting room, say, or my own kitchen at 3 in the morning when I cannot sleep, I will look at it next to a clock on the wall, the way I did in the room down the corridor. And almost every time, the two of them are running together, the way two clocks usually do, with their own small, unimportant drifts. Almost every time. I do not know what to do with the times when they are not. I have decided, mostly, not to do anything. I let them tick. I watch the second hand on the wall and the second hand on his watch, and I wait. And after a minute or two, they settle back into their ordinary disagreement, and the room becomes a room again. And I think about the chair facing nothing. And I think about the chamber waiting between acts. And I think about the phrase that someone, decades before me, took the trouble to underline in pencil so faintly that you could miss it if you were not paying attention. And then I get up and I make tea and I drink it this time. And outside, sometimes, it is raining. And I let the rain be what it is, and I let the watch be what it is, and I let my brother be wherever he is, in whatever way the block holds him, and I go on with my evening. The pressure is still there. It will probably always be there. But I have learned to think of it less as a stone and more as a door, and to be careful about which night I lift my hand to it, and which night I let it stay closed, and to remember, when I lift my hand, that the lock is thinking.